The Catcher in the Rye is a 1951 novel by the American author J.D. Salinger. Born in New York in 1919, Salinger, on his own account, was an average student at school. When World War II began, he was drafted into the army, saw action in several major battles, and participated in the D-Day landings. He met Ernest Hemingway before Germany's surrender, and the two men formed an instant bond, Hemingway being highly impressed by Salinger's writing. After VE Day, Salinger was hospitalized for combat stress. He'd been in counterintelligence for a while, and he later commented, "You never get the smell of burning flesh out of your nose entirely, no matter how long you live." Before the war, he'd written several short stories, including one called I Went to School with Adolf Hitler, but all were rejected. In December 1941, The New Yorker accepted a tale about a teenager called Holden Caulfield, who was later the protagonist in The Catcher in the Rye. But when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, it changed its mind. Understandably, the problems of a maladjusted teenager paled in comparison to America's sudden involvement in a global war. The New Yorker may have remembered Salinger because after VJ Day in 1946, it did publish a Holden Caulfield story. By that time, however, others had become interested. Collier's magazine and the Saturday Evening Post had already published Holden Caulfield tales. None of these was the exact precursor of The Catcher in the Rye, but they were close. The novel, which melded the stories, appeared in 1951. The Catcher in the Rye is a first-person account by Holden Caulfield of a weekend in his life which begins with his expulsion from a boarding school in Pennsylvania. He goes to see his teachers, gets into a fight with a former roommate, hires a prostitute with whom he just wants to talk, goes to see a play, goes ice skating, talks to his sister. I'll stop there because no plot summary can begin to explain what makes this novel exceptional. Why do most people read novels? I think the answer's been distorted by a small number of academics and literary critics who read novels for a living, whose voices have been represented out of all proportion to their numbers, and who've insisted that the traditional novel with strong characters and interesting story is defunct. It needs to develop. They're bored with it, and since they're the experts, that's the end of the matter. The probable truth, however, is that most people read novels in order to encounter other people, get into their minds, and consider what drives them. J.D. Salinger's biggest misfortune was that The Catcher in the Rye almost immediately became categorized as a young person's novel. I can understand why that happened. The voice is so strong, so radical, and so human. Holden Caulfield is one of the most sensitive and compassionate protagonists in the whole of Western literature, that it must have seemed threatening to some people. What better way to diffuse it than by assigning it to some yet to fully mature demographic, especially since it was already so disproportionately popular with young people. It's worth remembering, however, that it wasn't written as a young person's novel. Yes, it features a young protagonist, but we don't normally assume that novels are written solely for readers that resemble their protagonists. No novel could conceivably be universal on that understanding. In my view, The Catcher in the Rye is among the 10 greatest novels of the 20th century, possibly in the top 5. It took Salinger a decade to get to know Holden Caulfield, and having written about him, he never penned anything remotely as great again. But then who could? But don't take my word for it. If you haven't read it yet, do so. You must.